It's the Friday Cocktail, presented by Anna Glowinsky.
I'm Anna Glowinsky, and you're listening to It's the Friday Cocktail, and we're getting going with our first guest today. Delighted to have him on the line, Dr. Ben Rein, talking to us about the importance of connection, because in today's world, there's a lot of self-help or motivational talks around about, how you can become more productive, how you can improve as a person. But Dr. Ben Rein is talking to us about one of the most important things, actually, which isn't so much about self-improvement, but actually connecting with other people. Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks so much for having me. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good as well, my friend. So, talking about connection, why are friends so important?
Well, it's funny in your intro there, you're talking about, connection almost as if it's separate from self-help. It's so interesting because it is both self-help and source of fulfillment. And in addition to that, it's also other help. Connection is so good for us and good for our brains. It's good for our mood. It's good for our health. There are so many statistics I can share about how people who are more isolated are at higher risk for, dementia, heart disease, 50% higher risk of death by any cause. They're higher risk of depression, higher risk of anxiety. There are all sorts of consequences associated with being isolated. And the reason, to answer your question of why connection is so important, is probably because humans are a social species. We have evolved to exist in groups. We survive really well in groups. And so our brains actually reward us for being around others. Our brains basically feel good when we're near community, because that's an ancient signal to our brains that you are safe. When you're near others, you're safe. And so it's funny because it is self-help. We have these systems built into us now, a long time after being in groups was important for survival. We still have the same hardware in our brains. And so we feel good when we're around others, but it's self-help for that reason, but it also makes the person that you interact with feel better as well, because they have the same brains as ours. And so I really, I'm a neuroscientist by training. My research is in social interaction and what it does for our brains and how the brain systems that regulate it. So that's really the angle that I come at this from. But I also just love pointing out that, when you exercise, when you have a healthy meal, when you get a good night's sleep, when you do any of those things that are good for your health, you're benefiting yourself, but nobody else benefits. When you go and socialize with someone, you're also benefiting yourself in much the same way. I put socializing right there with any of those other benefits, but you're also spreading those benefits to someone else. So it is self-help. It's also other help.
That's such a nice thing. I wasn't expecting that comment. I've heard a lot about the importance of socialising, how it makes people live longer, etc., and all those sorts of things. But the idea that not only are you getting when you socialise, you're also giving. What a lovely idea. So what sort of things are happening inside of us biologically when we make contact with other humans?
So there are many things going on, and I'll do my best to share the neuroscience at a level that anybody can appreciate. What it really comes down to is two main systems. One is really important for mood. So I mentioned that our brains reward us for being around others. Our brains basically feel good when we're near others. The reason for that is because we have social reward systems in our brains. What that means is when we connect with others, there are certain signals in the brain, certain neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. Those are the three big ones that get released when we connect with others. The brain cells start to send those neurotransmitters to each other. And the names and biology of these neurotransmitters is probably less important than what they do. And many people have heard of dopamine. Many people have heard of serotonin. Both of those neurotransmitters are associated with basically positive feelings. Serotonin, of course, is linked to mood. It does a lot more than that, but it seems like more serotonin maybe means better mood. A lot of evidence for that coming from the world of SSRIs and antidepressants. If you boost serotonin, you seem to be able to boost mood. And then, of course, dopamine is this signal that what you're doing is good. Basically, it's good for you. You want to come back and do more. It's this sort of reward and reinforcement signal. And so when those neurotransmitters are released, when we socialize, it makes us feel good. It makes us feel like we want to come back and do this more. And so there's a bunch of evidence showing that right when you socialize with someone, your mood goes up, and it doesn't matter if it's, a quick interaction with a stranger or a deep interaction with friends. Both types of interactions, all types of interactions produce this benefit. Now, one of the other benefits of interaction biologically is that oxytocin, which is this social bonding kind of chemical, the love hormone it's been called, it's really important for making us feel good around each other and driving that just process I just described. But it also has all of these incredible health benefits that oxytocin doesn't just make us want to be around others. It also can be, anti-inflammatory. It can be neuroprotective. It can support bone growth. It can support immune function. All these great things. And it makes sense because if you think about, why would this happen? Well, again, evolutionarily, there's a lot of explanations in this when we think about it, like, where did we come from? Evolutionarily, one of the most important things is to reproduce. Of course, besides survival, it's to reproduce, produce the next generation. And so when you are falling in love and your body's producing lots of oxytocin, and then when you have a child and you're producing lots of oxytocin, it's really important that you're super healthy so that you can see that child through and you can raise it and be healthy to support it so that it survives. And so all these amazing benefits throughout our bodies really stem from connection. And of course, oxytocin can be driven by all sorts of connections with, friends, partner, romantic partner, children, you name it. But there's this incredible link between connecting with others in a meaningful way and basically protecting your entire body's health.
And how do we create those connections in a meaningful way in today's world? Because, there is this term going around that there's a loneliness epidemic, but how is that the case when we're living in bigger and bigger cities? We have social media. We have so many more interactions with people than ever.
Yeah.
So how do you make that meaningful?
Right. It feels counterintuitive, right? Because we're more connected than ever. I mean, right now, you and I are talking and we are, I don't know how many thousand miles away, right? This is pretty awesome that we can do this. And the same goes for social media. And, really what I think has happened is over the last decade or so, I call it the automation of everything. We've found ways to take all of these various systems and services and make them happen on a computer screen, on a phone screen, on a TV screen. We've automated everything. And, so now when you go to the bank, instead of talking to the human teller, you talk to the automated teller machine, ATM. And when you go to the grocery store, you go to the self-checkout when you interact with the screen instead of interacting with your cashier. And, you can work from home instead of going to the office. You can exercise on a Peloton instead of going to the gym. There's so many ways to do things conveniently by yourself. And we've removed a lot of these like tiny, I call them like social snacks, these little interactions that happen throughout our lives. We've replaced them with screens and automated services. And I don't think that's good. I think even a virtual interaction, like on a video call, on a phone call, that's not going to be as good for you as an in-person interaction. It is still going to be better than nothing, but it's not going to be quite as good as interacting face-to-face. And the reason for that is there's so much information built into our interactions. We have facial expressions and tone of voice and body language and all of this context that our brains just sponge up and use to understand each other. And when you go into, let's say, a phone call, you lose facial expressions. You lose the ability to see each other's body language. You lose this texture of our interactions. And that texture is what really fires up those brain areas that make us feel good when we interact, that make us experience empathy when we interact. And so there's evidence showing that basically the less lifelike your interactions are, the less benefit you will get from it, the less good you will feel after. And so I think to answer your question, just one way we can try to work on our social problem is by prioritizing in-person interaction. I had a friend reach out, a colleague, and he said, hey, can we set up a Zoom call? And I'm like, man, you live 15 minutes from me. Just come over to my house. Let's do this in person. It's as easy as that. Or if that's not possible, if you can't meet in person, try to level up your interactions. And so like if you're doing a phone call, try doing a video call instead. Or if you're doing a text message, do a phone call instead. If you can sort of get closer to a more lifelike interaction, you can restore some of that texture and make your brain kind of feel like it's actually in more of a realistic interaction. So the best possible thing, though, would be to build really strong infrastructure for people to connect in person, because I think we're missing a lot of that.
And what about for people who are introvert? I mean, does everyone need the same level of social interaction to get these benefits? Because, you get introverts, you get people who are proud to say, I prefer dogs over people, There's a lot of people who will say they don't want to spend time with other people.
Yeah, and that's valid. I happen to be an extrovert, but so it's hard, it's a little bit hard for me to truly understand the experience of an introvert. But here's what the data says. Here's what the science says on this. So I like to think of every human like a potted plant, in that we all have different watering needs, right? Like each plant, some like a snake plant, you only need to water it once a month, right? That's like an introvert. They only need some level of interaction until they're satisfied. And if they keep watering that plant, it can be harmful for the plant, right? It's easily overwatered. Whereas an extrovert is like, I don't know, I'm not really good at botany, where there's a plant that requires a lot of water, right? And so you need to be frequently watering the plant. And that's basically what the data suggests, is that introverts, if they get a little bit of interaction, they actually benefit. They feel better with a small amount of interaction. And that the amount of that interaction, or the amount of water they need, depends on how introverted or extroverted they are. There's pretty much a relationship that the more extroverted you are, the more interaction you need to feel happy, and the more you can tolerate before you start to feel uncomfortable. And so for introverts, the key, I think, is to make sure your soil doesn't dry out, because that's what's really common for introverts, is that with such infrequent waterings being required, it's really easy to go a long period without really connecting with anybody, and you feel fine. But I think that is where these negative health consequences come into play that I mentioned in the beginning, higher risk of dementia, all these things. Because I think that when we're not meeting our brain's needs, that's when we're, not feeling well. And similarly, someone who maybe, can get by on 4 hours of sleep, they might pull an all-nighter and feel okay, but they're actually, there's still some health consequence to that decision. So small interactions, figuring out what the level you can tolerate, basically, that's right for you, is my best advice for introverts.
And what do you have to say about spending time with people that you don't like very much? Because you could surround people might have really social jobs. They go into a big workplace with loads of people, but they can't stand their boss. The receptionist's annoying, so then they're using up a lot of their social battery in one setting versus perhaps not seeing so many people, or people that you really do like, your mum, your significant other, your best friend. What have you got to say about that?
I have this concept that I describe of a social diet that is this is the total sum of the interactions that you're taking in. And, like a nutritional diet, there are some foods that we just don't really like, but sometimes, those foods are important and healthy for us. And so maybe sometimes we should have them. But, I think ultimately the best way to approach those interactions are, if someone is causing you stress, like if it's a toxic relationship, someone just always making you feel bad, that's not going to be good for you, right? Stress is not good for us. But if it's a kind of, like a coworker who's just sort of I don't really like this person, but I have to be around them, It's like part of the social diet, right? It's like the broccoli on the side of the steak, right? It's in there. It's giving you some variability, but I wouldn't compose your entire diet only of interactions that don't serve you, right? It's like the key is to have these sort of nutritional meals, I like to say, sit-downs with friends, sit-downs with families, going to events, whatever it is that sort of fills your cup or waters your plant. Those are going to be the most important interactions, and, prioritize those. And I think that as far as the bad interactions or the less good interactions, as long as they're not stressful, I think it's okay. But I do think that, social stress is very legitimate, social anxiety, and we are so wired for social interaction, and we're so sensitive to social rejection. We're afraid of being kicked out of our tribes, right? These kind of ancient systems in our brains. And so there's a lot of serious stress and social pain we can experience from arguments and inflammatory relationships. So, I do think it's probably better to avoid those if you can, or cut them out a little bit.
Well, I mean, you really know a lot about this topic, and there's so many different aspects to it. So let's talk about now you and the book specifically. What drew you to this topic, and why did you feel that you needed to turn it into a book?
Well, as a neuroscientist, like I mentioned, I've spent like a decade in research labs studying the neuroscience of social interaction and the brain systems that drive us together. And, sometimes they don't work properly. And it's so fascinating to me. And, I built a career around that. But I've also discovered that this science is not really accessible. People cannot go on the internet and read my scientific papers or my colleagues' scientific papers because A, they're often behind paywalls, unfortunately, and B, they're completely full of jargon. And so, I appreciate deeply the process of taking science that's really complicated, full of jargon, and making it really clear to people. And I've been doing that online on social media for a few years with videos. But then, as this sort of major trend toward isolation has been developing the last few years, and this announcement of a loneliness epidemic, I realized, gosh, there's so much science here, there's so much neuroscience that explains really how important interaction is and what it does for our brains, but people can't really access it. They don't have the ability to go and read these papers. And so I've always enjoyed and felt that it was important to share learnings. Like you learn something and then you see someone else struggling with the same thing, and you want to share with them what you figured out and how to get through that problem. And that's kind of the sentiment of this book, is I wanted to share, I've read hundreds, thousands of studies on this. Here's what you need to know. Here's the actual science. And maybe by understanding the impact that connection has on our brains and bodies, you'll be a little bit more motivated to actually do it. So that when Friday rolls around and your plans are on the calendar, and then you look at the couch and you're like, gosh, I really kind of would prefer to just sit on the couch right now. I'm not sure about this social gathering. That in that moment, you'll pick the interaction because you know that it's good for you, and you can kind of imagine the impact it'll have on your brain.
So you were basically an expert already when you went into writing of the book, and you're putting all the information down. But in the process of writing the book, did you make any new discoveries, or did you learn anything else that you just hadn't stumbled across before?
Oh, yeah, I learned a lot. I mean, there's so much interesting research out there, and just unbelievable single studies where they found one thing and it's like, holy cow, I never would have put that together. But I think also just seeing the statistics, and because as I'm writing it, of course, I'm gathering the data on, what are the health consequences of being isolated, and, seeing all these different studies, from researchers in the area of, heart disease and stroke and dementia and depression, and all of these, thousands of studies saying being isolated is bad for this and that too. It was just really kind of startling for me, and also motivated me to get the book out quickly, because I thought, gosh, this is really quite a big problem.
It's urgent. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you want people to interact with the book? How does it work?
Well, I mean, it's a neuroscience book, but it's very lay friendly. It is meant for the every reader. In fact, the very first page is my no big words clause, where I basically say, science is full of jargon. This book is not. I apologize on behalf of the science world that, it's not always this accessible. But, the book goes through a lot of different sort of aspects of interaction. The part one, the first part of the book, is all about kind of what we've been discussing here. Like, why is interaction important and good for you, and what does isolation do to the brain? And then the latter parts of the book, I kind of address a bunch of different adjacent points. For instance, the science of likability, and what might you be doing that is not making a good impression? Is there anything you could do to improve that? I have a chapter on the neuroscience of dogs and why loving a dog is important, and what biological benefit we can get from befriending and, loving a dog. There's a chapter on empathy. There's a chapter on not sure if this is allowed to say, but drugs. I talk about various drugs and, ranging from alcohol to anxiety medications to SSRIs and, illegal drugs even like MDMA and psilocybin, basically talking about all these substances that we use often and how some people use often, not the illegal ones, of course, and how they're affecting our social brain and how they influence our interactions, like from a biological level. So, it's really kind of like just me trying to share as much information that might be useful for the general public. Of course, I try to make it interesting. Based on the reviews, I hope it seems that people tend to find it interesting. But there's also some exercises built in, some journaling, some like assessments, things to help you figure out, kind of how much watering your plant needs.
Well, well done for putting it all together, because I really do feel that society today, especially in the big cities and stuff like that, we're at a bit of a crisis point with mental health, with loneliness. So, yeah, fantastic work. I really appreciate you joining us on the radio this afternoon as well.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Bye-bye.